All right, cool. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get into tree IPM from the entomological perspective. I will mention that, trees obviously have other elements as well, like viruses, bacteria, fungi. So we're just focusing on some of those arthropod pests, those insects and what have you. And I also want to mention that it's a really big topic, and I'm not going to go over every single pest that you could possibly get on every type of tree. So if you ever do have questions or concerns, you can always contact me or your county agent and get a specimen sent in to the plant diagnostics clinic, or you could shoot me an email as well, like, hey, I'm dealing with something. Because I will say that even from last year to this year, some of the pests that I've gotten on trees are a little different. Like, for example, this year I've been getting a lot more plum aphids being sent in, like the ones that curl, the leaf curling plum aphids, that is. So I don't mention them on here, but I am going to talk about aphids as one of the pests. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I'm going to give an overview for this talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about IPM basics, and then I'll get into the bugs, and I'll kind of talk about the beneficials and the pests. So the beneficials are the insects that eat the pests. Like, I'll try to mention some of those. And I have this in junipers, pinions, and I should probably spell that differently. Sorry, I forgot to change these slides because I know here we like to spell pinion differently. I apologize for that. And then finally, I'll share some tips for attracting some of your beneficials. So, what is IPM, or integrated pest management? Basically, it's this approach to pest management where you're using cultural, physical, biological, and chemical controls to help suppress pests. So, yes, insecticides are a part of that, but the idea is that, you save those for later. You save the more like toxic and intervention using insecticides later. So, you use these other methods first. And this is so that you limit economic and environmental and health risks. So, not just dumping out a bunch of insecticides out into the environment. And also, if you are using insecticides, trying to use insecticides that are less toxic, for example, not using broad spectrum insecticides and trying to find something that's more selective if available. So, there's a lot of things that go into it. And the way that I like to think about it is that you're kind of being an ecologist, right? You are, because it's really complicated and there's all these factors and it varies case by case. So what I mean by case, it depends on your tree, like the species of tree, and also the type of pest that you're dealing with. So identification of your plants and your pests and your good bugs is really important for this to work properly, right? For IPM to work properly. So an example that I like to use, you have a lot of aphids in, let's say, what system? Cotton, and you use a parasitoid wasp to help reduce the pest population of aphids. So that's one strategy of IPM. Oops. So IPM really, the whole like base of it, or this, and I'll show you this pyramid that I like to use when I talk about IPM, but the basis of it is prevention. So what I mean by that is keeping things healthy and happy, keeping your plants healthy and happy, ongoing maintenance. So mulching, keeping your trees healthy, also maybe painting them to reduce sun scald, or just keeping them happy, right? Because a lot of these insects, they target stressed plants. For example, aphids will target stressed plants because it's easier for them to take advantage of a plant or a tree when it's under stress. Then identification is super important, right? So you might do these preventative things, but even the best prevention, you can still get pests from time to time. And sometimes we're busy, right? We don't always have the time to go out there and make sure that everything's clean and sanitary and perfect. So identification is super important. Looking at what you're dealing with, right? Correctly identifying your pests. And then looking also at damage, signs of damage, right? Are you seeing leaf feeding on your leaves? Are you seeing insect pupa on the ground, right? Like what's going on in your situation? So like scouting and looking at things from time to time can really help, because you don't want to let them feed too much, right? Catch them in the act like sooner than later. And then thresholds, some insecticides or treatment strategies have different thresholds. It really depends on what the system is, what pest you're dealing with, reading those labels, and then also looking at IPM strategies. So some things might be, for example, 20 to 30% of the leaves have damage, and then that's when you implement it. Or some things are more strict, right? The minute you see this pest, you have to act. And then finally, this is where the last stage of this is when you implement your strategy, right? Your actual strategies dealing with your pests, but cultural kind of feeds in with preventative and then feeds into IPM as well. So this is like a good look at it visually. So you start off with cultural methods, which is your preventative strategies. And then you're working up in this pyramid when you're finally using insecticides or pesticides, whatever. You know, you can apply this to other forms of pests as well. But for chemicals, for example, even those, there's more toxic ones and least toxic. So, you know, you can kind of break that apart. Biological control is the idea that you have other arthropods eating your pests. So the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And then physical mechanical, you're actually excluding your pests. So that's like, for example, if you've ants in your tree. So I've seen this season quite a few Taponoma ants, these odorous house ants tending aphids to keep them out of your trees and defending and protecting those aphids and having aphid populations explode. You know, you can put uh, this cardboard around a tree and then this tanglefoot, the sticky stuff, so the ants get stuck and they don't get up in those trees and take care of those aphids. And I'll talk about some of these methods with each pest and the different IPM strategies when I get into them. So chemicals, they are important tool in your toolbox, but there are ways that you can use them responsibly. So nowadays we know the effects of insecticides on pollinators. So the EPA does now have tools and strategies for pollinator protection. And there are now, even on labels, like suggestions, or not suggestions, but basically guidelines for when to spray and how to spray. Like, for example, if you have a fruit tree in bloom, you might not want to spray that because you have a lot of bees pollinating. So there are these strategies that exist at the local, state, and federal levels that you can look at and do some research before you schedule a spray. So yeah, chemicals are part of IPM, and there are strategies that you can use to help protect your beneficial insects. I've already mentioned some of them earlier on when I began this presentation, but really read those labels. Label is the law. There are these pollination protection statements now that can help. And it's always best to do this before you schedule an application, right? So being aware of what's active and when it's active. So trees in New Mexico that insects like, these pollinator insects like, basically any fruit tree. So fruit tree flowers have a lot of pollen and nectar that insects like, you know, the native bees we have, but also the Apis mellifera, the European honeybee that people use in almond production and what have you. There's also this list, this website here is really cool, treenm.org. It has a list of trees and you can plant that insects like in New Mexico, like these beneficial insects, but they're also nice because they're native. You can use them as shade trees and what have you. So sometimes I tell folks when they're dealing with trees here that are really stressed, that have borers, maybe to take a look at these trees and, you know, because at some point that tree, it's just a matter of when it will, you know, unfortunately die once they have borers. But, you know, you can think of other things that you can plant that might be more adapted for an environment that has drought or whatever conditions might exist. So I'm going to talk about some of these coniferous trees and shrubs. And junipers, I guess this is kind of like a gray area for some folks because they don't want junipers, but some people here do like junipers. So I deal with people that want to keep their junipers healthy and happy, but then other folks that want something else. So it's just your prerogative, but junipers can be good and they are native and there's lots of good things associated with them. It just depends on the area and what your purposes are. But the first one I'm going to get into that I've had quite a bit of are these giant conifer aphids and white pine aphids. So these are aphids that are specific to pines, and they're pretty large for aphids. Like aphids are these really small insects, but these ones are like about a quarter of an inch long, even maybe up to like almost half an inch long. They are typically dark in color and they look pretty leggy. They almost look like a spider, right? But they have six legs. They have that piercing, sucking mouth part. The adults may be winged or wingless. They have wing forms to transfer themselves to another tree when they're dispersing. And there are quite a few different species of these, but the management strategies are similar. So what you want to do is always check your trees for aphids, and that's because aphids, they some species can vector diseases, some species well, a lot of them can be tended by ants. And when this happens, is the way that these aphids feed is they're basically feeding on the plant juices, right? The phloem, and they constantly have to regulate their body. So they're spewing out this honeydew, which is really sugary and sweet, and ants love it. So the ants will tend to them like they're cattle, right? The ants will take care of the aphids, and then you have all this sticky honeydew, and you can get sooty mold to grow, and it just gets all sticky and messy, and the trees can get pretty sick from the feeding of the aphids, but also from that honeydew because of the sugary stickiness. So what you can do to manage the aphids, thankfully, there's a lot of strategies for aphid management, for IPM of aphids. As I mentioned, and you're going to hear this a lot in this talk, but culturally, keeping your trees as healthy as possible, if you can, right? If you can water them in drought, in hotter months, and do these things, fertilizing, that sort of thing. Thankfully, there's lots of things that love to eat aphids, not only that, ants that like to feed on their honeydew, but there's lots of things that actually like to eat them, like your lady beetles. So lady beetle adults and larvae really love to feed on aphids. Hoverfly larvae, as you can see here, this little gif of one ripping off an aphid and eating it. There are also these other critters that like to feed on them, like big-eyed bugs, minute pirate bugs, green lacewing larvae, parasitoid wasps. There's a variety of species of parasitoid wasps. So before you use chemicals with aphids, it's best to assess your natural enemy situation, because sometimes you have to have a little bit of patience with these natural enemies because it takes time for the predators and parasitoids to build up their populations and take them out. So yeah, but there are lots of insecticides available as well for aphids. So, but anyway. Juniper twig pruner, I had some of these sent in last year. They are these beetles with these long antennae. The adults are pretty small. They have a reddish head and a brownish black body. You can kind of see it here in this picture, but basically they have like a kind of mahogany looking head, and the rest of their body, like their thorax and their abdomen, are brownish, blackish in color. And they have these very distinctive long antennae. The larvae are small and white in color. However, you're not really going to see them unless you really try and cut them out, because they are inside of the plant. But as you can see here, here are some signs of them. These damaged junipers. You see a lot of yellowing of the leaves, kind of die back, and then a a sign, I'm sorry, it's been a long day, is that you can tell that they're there are these exit holes, right? These borers, once they're finished feeding as larvae, they exit the plant, and you can see these holes in the stems of the plant, the bark. So monitoring for them, management, as I mentioned, keeping your trees or your shrubs as healthy as possible, properly spacing junipers in urban settings. I don't know if anyone has that issue here really as much in New Mexico, maybe in like Albuquerque, but that's one thing to keep in mind, making sure that they're spaced appropriately, watering them. And if there is an infestation of these beetles, you can prune out the infested branches, right? And make sure to discard them because you don't want reinfestation. So don't like, compost or not compost, but like don't like leave it outside because the beetles will just come out and then mate and then go back to your juniper. So just make sure you bag them and appropriately discard or burn them. Chemical, unfortunately, for these guys, these juniper twig pruners, there are not labeled insecticides for them, but thankfully their damage is cosmetic and temporary, so it's not like one of those pests that you have to worry about too much. All right, scale insects. Scales are so weird, and there's a lot of different scales, so I'm only going to talk about some of them in this presentation, but juniper scale insects, they're also called minute cypress scales. They kind of look like eggs, like a fried egg. They have these like oval circular bodies with this, they're like that are kind of white, and then they have this circular yellowish center. They're pretty small, about 1.5 millimeter in diameter. Excuse me. And they do similar damage in your junipers. Like if you look at the leaves. They feed on the leaves here. It looks superficially similar to the beetle, but they're actually feeding on the leaves, not the inside of the shrubs or trees. So monitoring for these scales, they come out late May and late June using, I mean, they come out mid-May, late June. So what you can do to see if you have them, if you're concerned, you can use double-sided tape around twigs and assess it that way. Basically, they almost look like mites. They're very teeny tiny insects that crawl, and they're like yellowish, whitish in color, but they crawl. And this is the stage that insecticides are targeting, right? You can't target adult scales with insecticides because of their protective coloring. But what are some strategies you can do for management culturally? Keeping your trees as healthy as possible. Stress trees have a difficult time with scale infestation. There are some things that like to eat these scales. There are lots of natural enemies of them. So there are some uh, predatory mites, parasitoid wasps, and lady beetles that will feed on them. And as I mentioned with chemicals, there are insecticides available and also horticultural oils, but you have to make sure that you target the crawlers. And timing is so important with these because the insecticides are not going to work on the adults that are already settled and protected by their coverings. Another scale insect, the pinion needle scale. These are like little tiny bean-shaped dots on the leaves of your pinions. They cause leaves to yellow and die back. The females emerge from their little coverings in the late winter or early spring, and the males will emerge from their covering in the late winter or early spring as well. And that's so that they can mate, but the winged forms and the crawling forms are temporary. Another thing you can notice is all this webbing and eggs during that time of year, as shown in this right photo. So with these scales, these pinion needle scales, again, tree health, very important. There's a strategy for these that you can use mechanically or physically, which is a strong stream of water from a hose to dislodge the egg masses from the tree. And with these, like the other scales, there are insecticides available, but timing's really important. You're going to be applying when those females and those males are active and they're moving around and they're laying eggs, or those crawlers are moving around. So once a scale settles in its place and it's protected, insecticides aren't very effective. So it's really important, the timing for scales. Next thing that I've had a lot of sent in are mites. and particularly a lot of spider mites. And there are different species of these spruce and pine spider mites, but they are all kind of doing the same thing, the way that they feed, and they're all really small. To the naked eye, they look like a period. They have these oval, unsegmented bodies. They vary in color, so mite little periods moving around. They can be pink, green, gray, brown. And depending on species, populations can be abundant anytime in the spring and fall. Gosh, I think for like any tree pest that gets sent in during the year, mites probably are like throughout the year that I experience, except maybe the cooler months. But when populations are dense, a lot of these spider mites, you can also notice webbing and eggs around a plant. So it almost looks like spider webbing, but it's like this, this mass of like webbing. And their damage here, you can see this is a damaged juniper due to mite feeding. It's little bits of scraping away, yellow coloration. Here are some photos of mites under a microscope that I saw on juniper. But I've also had mites on like just so many other plants, so they can be a problem in general. But for these specific mites, monitoring them, managing them. When it comes to management, again, keeping plants as healthy as possible, and particularly with mites. And this is why in New Mexico we have a problem, or in the Southwest in general, with mites, is they like dusty areas. Mites really love dusty areas. So if you can remove dust if possible, which is really hard here, but you can sprinkle foliage a little bit and wash your spruce and pines. Biological, there are some natural enemies of plant feeding mites. They are predaceous mites, so mites that eat other mites. And with chemicals, there are chemicals available with mites, but you really want to look for selective miticides and acaricides, not insecticides, because these are not insects, they are arachnids. So it's really bad if you choose an insecticide and you kill like, your beneficials, and then you're left with mites and they are able to thrive because everything else is gone. And then you have like even a bigger problem with their population kind of bursting, right? So there are horticultural oils available as well. And it's important to note for spruce and pines that applications of horticultural oil can lead to a weird casts on certain species. So some people don't like the way that looks, but if you do use uh, these, you need, if you do want to use chemicals, using miticides. Pinion pitch mass borer, or the pitch moth. This is an insect that uh, is rarely observed. And if you do see it, you probably don't even recognize it as an adult moth because they're pretty drab and pale, boring looking. But you can definitely notice the damage from the larval's feeding. They make this oozing, nasty pitches of mass on your pinions. And you can, if you are curious, if you have it, you can carefully cut out some of that pitch and see one of the larvae as pictured here. They're like about an inch long, kind of whitish, creamy color. So for these, monitoring, managing them, one thing culturally that's been found for helping out with problems with pinion pitch mass borer is to avoid pruning during the summer months. And that's because injury to the bark attracts female adult moths, which are looking for a place to lay eggs. So they're like, oh, sweet, you like made my life easier. I'm gonna like lay eggs in this pruned section. So be mindful of that. As I mentioned, you can actually physically remove the larva, but be very careful with that. Don't cut yourself or anything like that. And unfortunately, with these chemicals, insecticides are not found to be too effective. So for this, it's really just trying to keep your trees healthy and removing those larvae physically. Now, another pinion type pest is the titmoth. These are a bit different in the way that they look and the way that they feed, but they are moths as well, but they're in a different family. The adults, they are kind of colorful looking. They can vary in their colors. Like this one's kind of orangey, and they kind of have like this molted patterning on them, and they hold their wings like a tent over their back. They can be up to an inch long. The larvae are pretty distinctive looking too for larvae of a moth that is a pest. They're kind of like reddish or brownish, like darker in color, and they got this very dark head capsule. So they're like reddish orange, reddish brown, and they have this really dark head. Their damage is pretty distinctive. They like to feed on the tips of pinions. So you can see here discoloration of the leaves and then this pitch near the tip here. So for these, monitoring and managing them, they have one generation per year. So you don't have to worry about them coming multiple times, but one generation per year. Emergence in their activity begins in the early spring. For these, what can you do? What are some of the IPM strategies? Keeping trees as healthy as possible. And then chemical that to prevent damage in areas where the moths are present, you can, if they are present, you can apply an insecticide, a pyrethroid to the foliage. So that's a good strategy for them. Not a whole lot of things that will feed on them like some of these other things. There are some general predators, but for these insecticides are recommended if they are present. Uh, the pine ips beetle. So any borer really is a frustrating pest to deal with, and that's because their damage inside of trees can be quite extensive. For this particular pest, which I've only had one person have a case of it since I started about a little over a year and a half ago, or a year and and a half. Um, Anyway, these beetles attack all species of pines. They are cylindrical looking. They're pretty small. They're 3 to 5 millimeters long, kind of dark in color. The larvae have this like C-shaped body, but what you're really going to see is the damage of what they do. Here's this top kill due to Ibs attack. So the top of the tree starts to die. Um, from them. You can see boring dust from Ipsit attacks. And with any wood boring insect, whether that's cottonwood borer or honeysuckle, whatever it is, like you can see some of the dust from the adults exiting from feeding. So with the Ibs specifically, and I guess, like I mentioned, this is on all of them, but really it is an important IPM strategy. But keeping trees as healthy as possible, and a particular thing for avoiding IBS, especially if you know the present, is to avoid creating logging slash from December to June, because this creates breeding grounds for the beetles. And chemicals. So with any wood boring insect, the insecticides that are available are all preventative. There are no insecticides that can be applied to a tree that will kill a wood boring insect outright. It's all preventative. So it's preventing the eggs from getting laid inside of the tree in the first place. So if you know you're dealing with a newly transplanted tree or a particularly stressed tree, right? We know that a lot of insects target stressed trees. Using these preventative insecticides will help prevent that becoming a problem in the first place. So just if you know your neighbors dealing with wood boring insects, and if you're worried about your tree, then maybe that's when you should apply some of these preventative insecticides. So moving along, I'm going to talk about some pests and beneficials found on fruit trees. Codling moth. This is a serious pest of apples, but also pears and crab apples. They really like palms. The adults are kind of drab looking. They're about half an inch to 3/4 an inch long. They have these molted gray wings. They hold them like a tent over their body. But one distinctive thing of the codling moth is that they have this like coppery brown band at the tip of the wing. So if you look at that picture there, you can kind of see how it's more coppery at the tips of their wings. The larva, pretty drab looking. They're beige with a dark head. But the damage for codling moth is usually how if I've gone out to like some apples, I that's what I see is the damage from them. They make these little stings, these tiny dimples on fruit, and they have these deep entries where they're pushing out their frass, which is the frass is the word for insect excrement. So you can see their frass. They make these tunnels. They push it out. These moths, they emerge in the spring near bloom time, and they lay eggs on fruits and leaves. The eggs hatch, and then the larva will burrow into the fruit. Full-grown larva will tunnel out of the fruit and pupate in debris beneath the tree's bark. And this can happen about 3 times or so a year, so 3 generations. So what you can do, monitoring for these is what's really important to keep an eye on them. If you have any apples or pears, checking for stings, entry holes, frass. You can monitor moth activity using pheromone traps as well. So what can you do? How can you manage these moths? There's a few things that can be done, but it's one of those situations where it's using a lot of these to keep on top of the pests, but removing and destroying any fallen and infested fruit, thinning fruits to prevent fruits from touching each other. This is a common entry point for larvae. They prefer that when the fruits are touching. If you have a small operation or just one tree, you can bag fruits. So there's this mechanical thing of excluding them where you can actually bag the fruits when they are half an inch to an inch in diameter. You can also band the tree trunk with sticky bands or cardboard. That's that idea of preventing them from crawling up, right? When they pupate, like from crawling up into the tree. There are generalist predators that like to feed on the larva of them, and there's also some parasitoids as well for different stages of the moths. Insecticides are only effective if larvae are killed before they enter fruit. So there are insecticides available. So monitoring them is important, right? To know if you need to bring out the big guns, the insecticides. But the thing with the insecticides is that it's not going to prevent the it's once the bug gets inside the apple, it's kind of like game over. You got a worm in your apple, right? And then horticultural oils can also be applied before eggs hatch. So there's a variety of things that can be done. Next thing, the apple maggot, also called railroad worm. These are fly pests of apples, pears, crab apples, hawthorn. This image here is of a plum. They don't really prefer that, but it was just kind of taking a picture to see that. But these are the things that they're typically pests of. The adult flies, they are pretty distinctive looking. They have these clear wings with black markings, and they also have 3 to 4 white stripes on their abdomen. So if you look here, head, thorax, abdomen, they got those little white lines on there. The larvae, they're going to be inside the fruit, but you can see the damage from the female fly injecting or ovipositing the eggs into the fruit. So you get this discoloration on the fruit, and in high infestations, you can have misshaped and distorted fruit. And from their feeding, you obviously get some rotting happening. So the adults of these, they emerge in the summer, and they lay eggs under the fruit skin by late summer. And the maggots will feed for about a month, and they emerge from the fruit by late fall. And then they will pupate in the winter underground in the soil near infested trees. So looking at your trees to see if they are there can be helpful. You can also monitor for the adults. There are sticky traps, and there are also these apple maggot traps, which are, the idea is that they mimic the apple and attract female flies. But both of these methods work for monitoring. And when you're monitoring for these flies, checking traps weekly during the growing season is important. So what can you do for these flies? Culturally, sanitation is really important. So harvesting fruits promptly, removing fallen and overripe apples, and removing any abandoned fruit trees. You can also um, apply Crayon oil, excuse me, Crayon clay to any part of the tree. This is not something that I've done, but I know some people use that, and it is an IPM strategy. There are insecticides available for these flies, but they should be used in conjunction with traps to determine if you should use pesticide application. So monitoring them with those sticky cards or those pheromone traps. And for these, natural enemies are not as effective, so timing of using your insecticides will be important. Next one, this is a native critter that we got here in the Southwest, the green fruit beetle, also called the fig eater. They can be known to be pests of apricots, peaches, plums, grapes, and just about any soft-bodied fruit. They also like oozing sap from trees, so they'll feed on sap of damaged trees. They're pretty distinctive looking. Sometimes they can be confused with the Japanese beetle and the green June beetle or bug. It's called green June bug, green June beetle, Japanese beetle. But I can tell you that these are pretty large, whereas the other two are not as large as this. And we do not currently have the Japanese beetle here in New Mexico. But as far as the fig eater here, they're pretty distinctive looking. They're about an inch long, pretty big, pretty bumbling. They're green. They got that tan line on the edge of their elytra. The grubs are pretty distinctive looking. They're big and juicy looking. They can be up to 2 inches long, cream colored. When disturbed, they'll go into a C shape. Damage. The damage from these is that the adults, they love sweet things. They love ripening fruits. And that's when they start to, they'll feed on fruits. But what you can do is you can just remove them. You can manage the grubs by removing leaf litter and decaying materials near fruit trees. So if you have compost, like checking that, making sure that, you don't have them present. And if you do, you can crush the larva if found. Some people say that they feed them to their chickens, but they're kind of large. And in my experience, the chickens are kind of a little intimidated by them, these big grubs, but you can get rid of the grubs, crush them if you find them, remove fallen fruit. I don't recommend using any sort of traps for them. They exist, but guess what? They just attract the beetles to your area and then you get more beetles. So it's kind of silly because these are not really like a serious pest typically, but they can be a nuisance at times because they do like to eat fruits and that sort of thing. And yeah, chemicals are not recommended for these, especially since they are attacking ripe fruits. That's it. Next, peach twig borer. This is a serious pest of peaches, apricots, nectarines, plums. The adults, they are kind of small. They're rarely more than an inch long. They tend to be a lot smaller than that. They have gray molted wings, a pointy head. The larva, the early instar ones, so the younger larva, they're light brown. Excuse me, they have light brown rings on their body and a dark head, and then the later instars get darker from that. The damage, the early generations, they bore into new shoots and kill them and causes the leaves to wilt, as in this picture in the middle right. And later generations of them will feed on the fruits. It's kind of like they're feeding on two different parts, which is, can be frustrating. And when you have large infestations of these, it can actually stunt tree growth. And this leads, this is because of the repeated terminal branch death. So that's why. These guys, they mature as larvae. Excuse me, the overwintering pupa. The larva will pupate in protected sites in the crotch of the tree branches and trunk. The larvae emerge during bloom, and they initially feed on the young leaves and buds, and then they bore into the shoot, causing it to wilt. Later generations bore into the fruit, so there are multiple generations of these. Here in New Mexico, you can have at least 3 generations per year. And then these moths will emerge in the spring. So monitoring and managing them, it's advised to check shoots in the spring, look for wilted shoots. You can prune and destroy infested shoots. There are natural enemies of the peach twig borers. There's many parasitoid wasps and even some ants like to feed on the larva. Chemicals, BT or spinosyids, when larvae are first active, that can be used, or when damage has been observed, or before they've entered the plant. So there are pheromone traps, and you can place them in the orchards in the spring, in May, that is. And this helps with the timing of insecticides. So the insecticides are used in conjunction with monitoring. Next up, the Western cherry fruit fly, Ragolides. These are pests of cherries. They look similar to the Western cherry maggot, but or the railroad worm, excuse me, they have those spotted wings, but they um they have these bands, but they're not as thick and white looking on them. And the way that the wings are a little bit different when identifying them. So as you can see here, each each species of these flies have distinctive wing patternation. These particular ones, the damage, high populations can ruin almost all the fruit on a tree, which is problematic. Like the other fly species that is a pest of apples, the apple maggot. There we go. I'm tired, y'all. I'm sorry. So these flies that are pests of cherries, they are difficult to determine when the fruit is infested until the larvae emerge from the cherry. So it can be a little bit frustrating. So monitoring will be important. But as far as their life cycle, what's going on, these Western cherry fruit flies, they pupate over winter in the soil. The adults emerge during late spring and or the early summer. The female flies will puncture the skin of the developing cherry and lay eggs within the developing fruit. The larvae will then feed in the insides of the fruit. Then they bore out of the fruit, fall on the ground, and burrow into the soil to pupate. So the adults are emerging from the ground, from the soil. So as I mentioned, monitoring them is really important. The Western cherry fruit fly, you want to do this daily until flies are seen. Hopefully you don't see them, but you know, if you do, there are insecticides that can be used. So again, with a lot of these fruit pests, these flies and whatnot, insecticides are used in conjunction with monitoring, making sure that you need to apply insecticides. For these flies, other things you can use that are not chemical based are cultural. You can remove you can remove fallen fruits, and also using ground barriers such as mulch and fabrics to reduce the fly's ability to pupate and come out of the soil, right? Make their life a little harder to come out. Next up, brown apricot scale. These are pests for a variety of plants. The ones that I've had sent in have been on apricot, plum, and pecan, but they can be a pest of grapes as well. As with any scale insect, the crawlers are those little tiny insects that are crawling around and the ones that you're going to target. As far as the adults on these ones, they almost look kind of like a turtle. They got this shinyish reddish brown covering. It's rounded and has a ridged back. And these, just like any scale from their feeding, leads to discoloration of leaves. You can get blackened areas on leaves and fruits. Some of them will feed on the fruits, some of them will feed on leaves, and high populations can cause twig dieback. So what can you do for them? As mentioned, you're going to be targeting the crawler stage. For these particular scales, these brown apricot scales, there's one generation per year. And the crawlers, that little mobile stage, they're going to be coming out in the late spring. Excuse me, they're going to be coming out in the summer and fall. And that's when you can target and use insecticides if needed. So monitoring for them, checking for them. There are some things that like to eat scales, which is good. These particular scales, lady beetles, lacewings, parasitoid wasps, that will target the crawler stage. And there are some that will parasitize the adults, but not for these particular scales. So it just really depends on the life history of scales and that sort of thing. Peach tree borer. This is a very serious pest of peaches, plums, apricots, cherries, and other stone fruits. They're pretty distinctive looking. The adults are pictured here. The males and females mimic wasps, meaning they look like a wasp, but they're not a wasp. They can't sting you. And it's just a defensive thing so that, you know, predators don't mess with them. The larvae, they are cream colored, they got a darkened head. They will feed on bark. So the larva damages trunks, lower limbs, and roots, which can result in tree death. Like their feeding can definitely lead to a dead tree. They also have this gymnosis, these balls of sap that you can find on the trunk or around the base of a tree when there's borers active. So you can kind of see that sticky stuff. Um, Pupa, they can sometimes be found at the base of the tree. So if you ever see something like this near a peach tree, it's best to remove it, like the bottom left picture. These moths, they emerge during the summer and they immediately lay eggs on the lower trunk bark or within soil cracks. Larvae will bore into cracks in the bark or through wound openings. So any sort of wound on the base of the tree, that's where they can enter. They feed on sapwood until cold weather arrives. The larvae will overwinter underground and begin feeding again as the weather warms, and then they will pupate near the base of the tree. So what can you do if you're concerned about peach tree borers? You can monitor for them. There are pheromone traps available. It's looking for adults, and then you can leave these traps throughout the growing season. It also helps reduce populations. It's actively, getting some of them culturally. So again, happy trees are healthy trees. I mean, healthy trees are happy trees. You can also avoid, damaging. Be careful if you're, mowing or weed whacking or anything near the trees. Avoid, getting them damaged. Avoid mulching up to the base of the tree, giving those, pupa a place to hide, because they can actually come out from there easily. Unlike those flies we were talking about, where mulching can help, for them, it does not. There are some things that like to feed on them. They do have some natural enemies, lacewing larvae, spiders, parasitoid wasps that attack the egg, larval, and pupal stages. And there are insecticides available, but they're considered preventative. They only target the egg and early larval stage. Next one up, bagworms. I get a lot of bagworms sent in. Bagworms can be pests of many different plants, many different trees. They're pretty distinctive looking. They have this casing around their body that they use leaves and or twigs to cover their body. Just gonna show you all this because it's so crazy. It's so cool. But I found the biggest bagworm that I've ever seen. This thing's pretty big, but anyway, they are enclosed in this protective case. Adults will the females never become weaned. The males do, so they go through complete metamorphosis. And the male, as you can see here on the right side, the upper right side here, they'll mate with the bag, and then the female becomes this egg case essentially. They're damaged. They can be major defoliators, and if they take off too much leaves from feeding, that can result in plant death. So bagworm eggs, they'll hatch in mid-spring to late spring up until early June. After hatching, bagworm larvae emerge from the bag, and then they spin down a strand of silk and they balloon to nearby plants. So they put out a little bit of silk, and then they um, find a place that's suitable, and then they make a bag around their body. So they leave the female's bag, they get to a place, and then they make a bag on their bodies themselves. They'll feed until late August. So we do have some bagworms feeding right now across the state. Mature bagworm larvae, they attach to a branch and then they emerge. The adults will emerge in the early fall. So around September, this is when the mating happens. And then the female will become a mummified egg case, and then the eggs will hatch again in early June. So that's their cycle. What can you do? Monitoring for them. You can just check your plants for these funky little bagworms, the little leaves and twigs around their bodies. You can actually just hand pick them off and place them in a bucket of soapy water. It's best to do this in early spring and late fall. There are lots of things that like to feed on them. But if the natural enemies aren't doing too good of a job, there are insecticides available and they target the young larvae. So you have to do this in the spring. So there are things labeled for bagworm control. Aphids, we're back to aphids. Like the pines, we do have aphids that are basically pests of any fruit tree. There's lots of different species of them. And they all do similar things. The aphids, from their piercing sucking, they can damage leaves. They can also, some of them can vector viruses. Some of them get tended by ants. We went over a lot of this already. Some aphids even can make galls happen, or some aphids can cause physiological changes in the leaves, like the curling leaf aphids. Checking for aphids, it's best to check, the presence on leaves and twigs, looking for them, checking your plants for them. You can rinse off plants with high pressures of stream with water to dislodge aphids. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, as an example of an IPM strategy using cardboard with tanglefoot on it to prevent ants from tending to the aphids. Lots of things love to eat aphids. And there are insecticides that are available except for woolly apple aphid. They underground infestations of woolly apple aphid. But otherwise, there are lots of things that you can do for aphid management. So for some of these beneficial insects, and they didn't get their own profiles, but I did mention things like lady beetles, green lacewing larvae, parasitoid wasps, minute pirate bugs. We have a lot of literature and handouts and pamphlets on this at New Mexico State University, like what they are, like who they are, insectary plants that are available for them. But, you can enhance your environment, your area to attract them. So using a variety of native plants to provide a variety of food sources and shelter. You can also provide a mixture of features in your landscape for habitat for them. Identification is super important. I didn't get into it in this presentation, but there are some species of insects that superficially they look like a pest, but they're not. For example, like stink bugs, there's predatory stink bugs and there's pest stink bugs, and the predatory stink bugs eat the pest stink bugs. But, really looking at your bugs and making sure that, you're getting the identification right is important. And with natural enemies, being patient, because sometimes it takes days or weeks for them to reduce populations of your pests. And when choosing insecticides, consider selecting ones that will target your pests specifically if they exist, right? Rather than the use of broad spectrum insecticides. And then, it just comes back to this idea of keeping plants healthy, and healthy ecosystems have fewer pest outbreaks. So insectary plants, I mentioned this idea of insectary plants. This is just three examples. These are plants that are proven to attract and sustain beneficial insects, so natural enemies like these parasitoid wasps, these other predators, because they still need a place to drink nectar, a place to like take shelter. So these are some examples of things you can use in your landscape. So thank you. And with that, I will take any questions.
Judy, you have a question in the chat box.
Okay. Let's see here. We're seeing the next. Okay. Question about systemic insecticide uses for preventing borer damage, for example, IPS. Are there concerns about systemic insecticides affecting other non-target insect species? That is, what are the ecological and/or environmental drawbacks from using systemics for prevention? That's a really good question. And, they can harm other insects as well. Thankfully, like, with these contact things, it's not going to really be affecting the flowers and the Sure, you can ask questions. Sorry, I should have made it a little shorter, but I thought that I had an hour and then I was like, oh, okay, like 45 minutes. And then I forgot that you do the intro. So I apologize for that. But also, if you guys want to leave, you can always email me questions as well. That's totally fine. But I can answer them now too. I'm still here in my office. We're good.
You're fine. No problem. If you guys have any questions, Marissa, I see you have a few, so you're unmuted. So go ahead.
Thanks. Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you. And I didn't mean to cut you off when you were describing the, the effects of the systemics. I guess I just, before recommending systemics to somebody, I am generally cautious. But is it true that only the insects that would try to feed on your tree would be affected by that systemic insecticide? In which case, you see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's the idea, right? Like that you're targeting a certain type of area that they're feeding, right? So you're not really going to be harming um native bees that are in the area unless like
Yeah,
they're in the crossfire, right? Does that make
right.
sense? Yeah.
I think so. I think thank you. Um thanks. And then another question is when you find stink bugs in the garden, are there quick tips for distinguishing between the good and the bad, or do we
You
just
know.
need to have no, I don't know the answer. No, I know. Like we saw one the other day and then we had to take like 20 minutes to go look it up, and I should have just texted it to you. but
Yeah, no, you should.
but
Yeah, and
I guess I just like without trying, I'm not an entomologist, and without learning all of them, what would you recommend I look for if I know quickly if it's something to step on or something to leave?
no, and that's a really good point. And I thank you. Sorry for teasing because I know we've talked about this topic before, and we only found the pests, right? The one with the skinny mouth parts. So, and it does take time, right? And it's totally okay to send photos to me too, Marisa, if you need to. Like that's totally okay. Because like when you're learning, sometimes it's good to get a second opinion, right? When you're
Yeah. Yeah.
taking the time to learn this identification. There are lots of really good resources like iNaturalist. I love
Uh-huh.
Bug Guide. I'm like on there like browsing the
Yeah.
photos a lot myself. And even now, like I've noticed like I have an iPhone and it's creepy how well like I'm curious as to
Yeah.
identify some bugs and sometimes it's right, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes it's wrong, but it's getting you in that ballpark. But as far as telling the difference between a predatory stink bug and a pest stink bug is their mouth parts or
Yeah.
are
I
them
kind of remember now that you said that. I remember you saying it before, but I've forgotten that I even asked you. So, yeah, how do we look at the mouth parts? Continue,
right.
please.
So flip them over. If they are a pest, it's going to be like a skinny straw, like a long skinny straw. It's going to be the mouth part's going to be like the same width of it, it's going to be long
Hmm.
and skinny. Whereas a
Okay.
predatory one, they're shorter and like sharper. Like think of a
Okay.
straw versus like rebar or something like that. So like
Okay.
um I should just have a diagram of this because like I
Yeah.
feel like this
Okay.
has come up a lot, but like you'll have like a sharper thicker kind of one versus a skinnier one, right?
Okay.
Because you have to pierce, as a predator, you have to pierce the exoskeleton of your pests and feed on that way. And there are different species of the pests and the predators
Right.
too,
All
right?
right.
So it's just like,
Yeah.
if stink bugs, for example, like if you're encountering stink bugs as pests or leaf-footed bugs, just
Hmm.
getting acquainted with those, right? You don't have to
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
every single pest. I mean, we do, I guess, but
Right.
everyone else, like, if, what are you growing? What's in your landscape, right? What are the things you're worried about? Like learning those and not being too overwhelmed by like, oh, these, but if you see it, then maybe learning a little bit
Yeah.
about that group or
Yeah.
learning about what damage you have and, what bugs you're seeing in your landscape because um sometimes there are things, I mean, I've even come across folks that for example, this lady was crushing the fig eaters just because she thought they were Japanese beetles, but they weren't really doing anything. But then she learned the differences between the beetles and what actually were pests and the things that were causing damage. And then she stopped killing the fig eaters because they weren't really doing anything and then focused more on some of these bugs were actually like feeding on the leaves in her tree, right? Not the
Right.
fruit. So like learning what they're feeding on, what they are, like can save you time, right? She was out there crushing these beetles and like wasting her time.
Yeah.
And she like actually learned what the pests were. And I mean, I know this is a simplified example of it, and what you're talking about is a more complicated
Well, no, yeah,
topic.
I think your point is taken that so I may and the public people, regular people who aren't trying to to teach this stuff, they might see an insect and just be overwhelmed. But your point that there's relatively fewer species in your backyard, so you could just get to know those and
Right.
not look at it as such a struggle. But
Right.
so I think that's going to be helpful. And then the let's make an infographic about the different mouth part shapes and
I
all
would
that.
love to do that. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, please, yeah, hold me accountable. Like, send an email.
Okay.
Like, let's totally do it. I'm just,
And
yeah, I
then
think that would be a great
yeah,
idea.
I have one more question, and I'm sorry for pushing everybody over, but I hope these are questions that can help others also. And um, when you talk about the insects, and I've now forgotten the name of it, that is boring into the apples, not the apple maggot, but the other one, the that when the two apples are next to each other.
Oh,
Uh,
coddling moth. Oh, you've
yeah,
had
codling moth.
those being a
Yeah.
problem. Yeah.
So we do have problems with that, and I see it in that it's almost every single time there are two apples touching, there's damage in between them, and I get it why in terms of that's just like a dark place that seems to be nice for the insect, but would you walk through what's actually happening there? Does that mean that that's where the insect is entering from the shoulder of the apples where they're touching? Like,
Right. I mean, they'll
yeah,
still enter. I mean, they just prefer that type of area because, like you said, the safety, like it's
uh-huh,
it's easy for them to access it. So they'll prefer it. They'll still, if they'll still go after fruits that aren't touching, but they
uh-huh,
more prefer that, and that gives them a place to hide from, predators or parasitoids and get into that fruit because they still have to like get into it,
uh-huh. Okay,
right?
so yeah, and it usually causes damage on the other side too, but it seems like it's like it's just because it's touching that. Like the insect didn't go into both apples, right? Like
Right.
right.
Right. They
So
just get into one.
but see, it does seem like the other one is they're both usually bruised or damaged in that
You
same
probably
spot.
have two. You probably have more. You probably,
Oh,
uh,
maybe.
and I
Okay.
noticed that too at at those slowness, remember the apples that are out there
Yeah.
that, yeah, like I definitely noticed the ones with the apples that are touching, there's more of them, but
Yeah.
there was even a case, I don't know if you remember this, but we were cutting them open
Uh-huh.
and there was like two that were touching and they both had a moth on them.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. And then so that's where the moth is entering from the shoulder of the apple. And then sometimes you find some frass or damage, it seems like on the flower end of the apple fruit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It's easier for them to I think it's because just easier for them to like eat and tunnel into the fruit that way, but I'm not
Okay.
100% on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks. This is great.
Good.
That was really helpful, Marissa, because I am dealing with stink bugs in my own area. But that would be really helpful to kind of get us distinguished between different variety of stink bugs now that you mention it, because I have been kind of not dealing with chemicals just because they're fruits and I'm pregnant, and so I'm just like,
Oh, yeah.
oh, I think I best just not do that route instead. I'm not sure if this is entirely helpful, but I just been getting those stink bugs and putting them in soapy water.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
No, that's
I'm
definitely a
sure.
strategy.
Oh, okay, so that's helpful.
Right. Another helpful thing. So, and I'll tell you this, I actually
Yeah.
did have someone send in some damaged pecans last week asking if it was stink bug damage because
Yeah.
there are stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs that will feed on fruits, and then it leads to like this cat facing, the way that the damage looks. Like people think it kind of looks like a cat face, but it's like this weird like
Yeah.
pattern.
I see that
Yeah,
a lot. Like kind of like a dimpled, like most
yeah,
dimples.
yeah.
Yeah.
But sometimes like you're like, I don't, it's always best to actually have the insect, right? Not just like to like catch it in action because there are some other things that can happen to fruits that look that way. But it is pretty distinctive, and you're like, I'm pretty sure
Mhm.
it's this. There are other cooperative extension resources out there. So like UC Davis, Colorado State, Utah, like if we don't have a particular publication on something, you can trust the information that comes from cooperative extension until someone's able to get to that or what have you. So I do use resources. We're developing our own, but for example, a perfect example of this is elm seed bug. So elm seed bug is a nuisance pest that only has become a problem in New Mexico, specifically northern New Mexico. So like Albuquerque, Los Lunas north, not really down here in Las Cruces, but it's just been the last few years being a pest. So as I'm trying to get resources, figuring out where it is, and write up a publication specific for New Mexico, I've been letting people or I've been giving the county agents and folks like, residents, people dealing with these bugs, resources from Colorado State and Utah State, for the time being, because you need to get out information to them as soon as possible, right? So we know that there's like research done on this. So if you do need something, it's totally good and kosher to go to another cooperative extension institution and use their resources if it's not available, immediately available at NMSU, right? But I can always like follow up or confirm things too, right? Look at things. But yeah, if you are dealing with stink bugs, there are resources available for those in types of orchards. But I don't know if your system is different or what, because there's stink bugs that are pests of vegetables, there are stink bugs that are
Right.
pests of fruit trees,
Yeah.
ones.
Um,
Yep.
Mine is just raised beds and just basically corn, melons, and squash. They really burrow themselves into the mulch
Yeah.
Oh,
and they just,
Right.
yeah. So now that you said there's a distinction between other stink bugs, and I'm not sure if I'm killing the the ones that I need to have, my attention on or
Right. Watch them.
yeah. So yeah, I guess if you I am curious now that you know to look out for it, if you will see a difference, right? So maybe all the ones you've been putting in your bucket are the pesty kind, but maybe you could, I don't know. It's interesting to see if you find more of the numbers of the beneficial kind through time. Yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah. Yeah. And like if you're curious, like just look at their mouth parts, take a look. Like, you're probably dealing with the pests if you're finding them a lot on your plants, but you can observe them, see what they're doing. You can always send me photos like of their mouth parts, like the
Mhm.
the ventral side, flip them over, send me some pictures of those if you're curious.
Okay.
But that's totally fine, like what you're doing, like putting them in a bucket of soapy water.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Excellent. Well, at least I'm doing something right.
Yeah, yeah. That is something you can do. Like that is good old fashioned mechanical control.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're so
Um,
annoying, like stink bugs and like squash bugs and leaf-footed bugs. They like to hide
yes.
too, and they're like, but
I know the feeling. So I'm trying to prune my squash or my squash plants so that way they don't really make a home underneath.
yeah,
So try my best, but it's hard. I already kind of knew that I'm gonna deal with this. I'm just taking it a step at a time. But thank you so much.
yeah.
Are there any questions from our audience?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a quick question or two
Yeah.
questions.
Yes.
Um, does the presence of ants always indicate infestation?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, you were breaking up.
Do, do the presence of ants on trees always an indication of pests also?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No, not necessarily. Sometimes, because there's lots of different species of ants, and some ants are arboreal, and some ants are even beneficial that like to eat, other insects and things like that. But there are ants that do tend to aphids. So if you're noticing stickiness and lots of aphids, that's when you know you might have a problem because you can
That's the
actually
signal.
see the
Okay.
ants. Yeah, you can see the ants with them. But if you just see ants and you don't see any aphids, like,
Then
you're
those are most
probably,
likely the beneficial ones. Okay.
yeah,
Okay. Just make
maybe.
sure.
Yeah. maybe, but yeah,
Okay,
it just
I gotta
depends.
take a closer look then. It's a peach tree, so
Yeah,
uh,
oh yeah, I would definitely look because I've definitely seen ants tending aphids on peach trees in New Mexico. So I would take a look for
take
sure.
a closer look. Okay, thank you.
Hmm.
Second question. Um, a lot of the biological protection mechanisms were like flying insects.
Yeah,
How do you
get them to
invite them
stay.
over to, how do you invite them over to, protect your plant or tree?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? Keeping them
Do
there,
you like
right?
get a hive and just stick it over there? Or yeah, I
Right. So there's different forms of, and I didn't get too much into this in this presentation, but with biological control, there's augmentative and there's also conservation biological control. So the idea of augmentative is to actually purchase and mass release them or release them throughout the season, right? And inoculative. So you can actually purchase things like green lacewings and lady beetles and
oh,
hope that they're just going to feed on them. But that's something you'd have to do like every year, right? Now,
okay.
conservation biological control, this is where I was getting the idea of insectary plants and shelter for them, um,
Okay.
or natural enemies. So another thing is like having different types of grasses in your environment, like cool and warm season grasses, like
Hmm.
Indian rice grass, having things for them to actually live and take shelter and feed on other insects when the pest isn't in a high population, right? So they might be feeding on things that aren't pests of your area, but they might be in your landscape, right? But the
Okay.
idea of that is to like have these plants that are known to be more beneficial than weedy plants that might actually be harboring pests. So that handout, the insectary plants that you can use, there's like a whole list of them. Those
Uh-huh.
are to like feed and shelter some of these things so that they'll be more in your area and ready to get at your pest rather than you being like, oh, like come here, right?
Okay. Okay. Surprising. I didn't know you could buy them. Okay.
Yeah,
That
some you can buy
question.
them.
Great.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Not
Thank
all
you.
of them, but yeah, you're welcome. Like if you're dealing with particular, there's even we can have a whole lecture on just this with parasitoid wasps, but there are parasitoid wasps for certain pest species of insects that are commercially available, like trichogramma that parasitize insect eggs, but not every pest has them commercially available. Just some do. But for these generalist predators that like soft-bodied insects like lady beetles, green lacewings, minute pirate bugs, they are commercially available. Yeah, you can even get them shipped to your place. But
Awesome.
what's the local? I know Marisa, you've had some examples. I mean, experience with like local garden centers selling them, right? Maybe, or maybe she's not. It's
Oops.
okay.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I started laughing immediately because my experience is that before I studied anything about plants, I bought some and they died under my care. It was like 1,500 ladybugs, and I loved them, and
Wow.
I put them. Yeah, and it was in a little mesh bag, and I got them at that time. I got them from a Osuna nursery, but since then I've seen them at lots of other nurseries, more in this earlier spring. But there's concerns about like they're fun. I just have killed them, and then sure, you see them right away when you put them out, but maybe I haven't tried to track to see if they're sticking around.
Mm.
So but it is fun in terms of like getting people engaged as long as you keep them safe until you put them out, which is
Right.
what I did wrong. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good note. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's instructions and stuff, so you can, All right. I see a question. Excuse
Thank
me.
you.
I'm so thirsty, but now I'm like, I accidentally burped like twice during this presentation. I'm so sorry. I see a question about the aphid I've received a lot of. That's the leaf curl or the leaf curl plum aphid. So here's some information on that. But yeah, that's the one I've gotten sent in. And then is pitch moth actively related to moisture? Oh, it's that. Is pitch moth activity related to moisture? It looks like it's more common in a medic environment. I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know on that one. All right.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and close it up right here. Just want to have a big thank you to Dr. King for providing this great information here. I mean, I am learning more about entomology from you in your presentation. So it's so thankful. I'm
Yeah.
thankful for having you on here. If you guys have any questions, maybe Joanne, you can probably put down your email if they perhaps have any
Yeah.
questions. But
Yeah.
other than that, we'll go ahead and end our presentation here for today. I just want to share with you guys some quick information on some upcoming events that we have set for this August. And let's see. Okay. All
Oh,
right.
cool. You do in-person stuff too. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. So like we are engaging more into in person now, and COVID has been lifted, and so we're trying to get our foot through the door and get more of these workshops going in person, and everyone's kind of striving off a little bit from webinars, but that's okay. We do have a food preservation workshop, but this one's going to be on jams and jellies. And this is going to be on August 8th. So for those of you that live around here near Crown Point, it will be at the Crown Point Wellness Center. There are two wellness center, as it was pointed out to me before. There is one at Navajo Technical University, which is not there. The Crown Point Wellness Center that I'm talking about is located by the flea market, between the flea market and the Crown Point High School area. So this is going to be taking place at 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. So we're going to get really in depth on how to water bath some jams and jellies. So we're going to be doing some hands-on practices on that. So that should be fun. We do have another gathering summit. If you haven't been to the one that we have hosted or co-partnered with Dene College last year, they are bringing back another one. So this one is run by Dene College Land Grant Office, and this one's the 2024 Food Gathering Summit. And this is going to be hosted at Shiprock Chapter House. There's going to be hands-on demonstrations, resource information booths. There are going to be some, I believe, presentations on foods, native foods, health, and demonstrations on preparing our traditional foods. So that should be interesting. Don't forget to register if you do plan to attend. So it's going to be both the 15th and the 16th. And the information down here is where you can get your, if you have any questions, reach out to Beverly Maxwell. I'm sorry, not Beverly Maxwell, but Colleen Wood, and she'll help you out to answer any of your questions. But that's what's going on for August 15th and 16th. We do have a livestock first aid training that is coming about this year. We're only hosting one training this year, but next year we're hoping to strive for two trainings in different areas. So we have livestock producers all over the reservations, and so we want to have trainings that are a bit far from each other, so that way we can accommodate everyone. So we do have one, this only one, going to be hosted at Dene College South Campus, and that is behind the Bash's Supermarket out in Shiprock, New Mexico. And this will be on August 23rd, starting at 10 a.m. through 4 p.m. So this is going to be presented by Dr. Wenzel, and he is our NMSU Extension veterinarian, and he's going to do some hands-on vaccination demonstrations on all three species. So that's both cattle, sheep, and horses. So if you have time on the 23rd, please stop by. If you are going to be participating through the full training, families, one bag per family will get a livestock kit bag. So Dr. Wenzel is going to go through each species on how to use that kit bag. So for emergencies only. So definitely tune in. And if you are going to be, attending this training, and August 23rd is pretty vacant for you, please register. If you are on a laptop, head over. If you're on your laptop, take out your phone and scan the QR code, or you can register at our website at https, or I should just say an easier way, nsa.nmsu.edu. But if you have any questions regarding any of these events, feel free to contact me. My name is Mikkel Silversmith, and my email is kelly96@nmsu.edu. And like I said, we do have an active website. We do have a conservation planning program, which is pretty the forefront of our NSA project as well. We do assist a lot of producers here on the reservation, both in Eastern and Northern Navajo agencies, with conservation planning assistance. So if you know anyone that is a grazing producer that needs help in developing a conservation plan, we definitely do that free of charge. And to get a hold of our conservation planning program specialist, her name is Shirley Toth, and here's her email. So if you are interested in wanting to learn more about our CP program and how we go about it, or want to have workshops hosted to kind of have your producers be aware of how they can submit a conservation planning or conservation plan, definitely reach out to her. And we're on Facebook. We always update our producers on our upcoming events. We do have a YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and shared on our YouTube platform. And we do have a bi-monthly newsletter. So we're kind of a bit behind for our May and June newsletter, but it will be coming out shortly. And other than that, I just want to say thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight. It was a great presentation, and I wish you guys all have a good rest of your evening. Thank you, you guys.
Thank you.
We're called the Navajo Sustainable Agriculture Project. It's a New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service initiative to deliver in collaboration with two of our outgoing project partners that you see a lot of their flyers and their logos on our flyers, I mean. So we share a lot of educational outreach from sheep and goat vaccination clinics to livestock first aid trainings to gardening with what type of water storage capacity that you can start implementing in your garden, irrigation systems for backyard gardening, and so forth. So we use a lot of expertise from these folks, and they're pretty helpful in delivering these educational opportunities, both in the areas that we serve, which is McKinley County, San Juan, and Cibola County. So the project that the NSA is funded by is called the USDA Outreach and Assistance for Native Farmers and Ranchers and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers Program. So I kind of touched base a little bit on the first one, improving the operations, both profitability and sustainability for our farmers and ranchers and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers Program. So we try to use a lot of expertise, not only coming from COPE and land grant, but also using our specialists coming from New Mexico State University and sharing their research and what they have worked towards in delivering these publications. So we use a lot like today's presenter, and as well as Ms. Thompson, who's actually on here as well. So we use her expertise. We've done some workshops with Dr. Ward and Dr. Gifford, Dr. Campbell, and so forth. So we use a lot of their expertise in both webinars and in person as well. They have gone, they're no strangers to our area, so they practically have been driving all over the reservation for developing these workshops with us. So, and our second bullet point is obviously to increase our producers' knowledge in the USDA programs. All of you on here are pretty much aware of NRCS and FSA and rural development and risk management agencies. So every year we do try to implement a resource fair, but virtually. You probably have seen them, you probably have come across them. And that is just basically sharing with our producers the here locally what type of programs, local programs that they can apply for, whether that is through NRCS from San Juan County or NRCS from McKinley or Cibola. We actually had folks that have come from both each counties deliver what type of local programs that their local producers can deliver. And other resource providers. And what I mean by resource providers is the Navajo Nation Department of Agriculture is one of them. A lot of producers here on the reservation are quite familiar with the Agriculture Infrastructure Fund. So they have a lot of incentive programs underneath the AIF that are really funding opportunities for producers here that reside on the reservation. So that's one of them. And lastly, increasing our local productions and consumption of our fresh fruits and vegetables and healthy foods by Navajo families and individuals. Like I said from the far beginning, we use the expertise from our project partners, I'm sorry, excuse me, to share their expertise in both garden and planting and seed preparation to how to build up a hoop house in your backyard. So we work a lot closely with them whenever we have interactions with local BIE schools. And that's one thing is a lot of these schools have want to consider growing their own produce and having the kids really engage in that. So definitely we reach some schools and help develop kind of a material list, and from there we go on and each month trying to build it up as we go.